Time for another video, and before we get started, a big thank you and shout out once again to everyone who has liked and subscribed so far. It's really cool to see so many other people who are as passionate about learning art as I am. If you are new here, I'm trying to improve my painting and drawing skills across a 10,000 hour time frame, but making my improvement as fast and efficient as possible by using techniques from the world of meta-learning, neuroscience and autodidacticism. And today we're going to look at how to figure out where you are on your learning pathway, baselining your current level for future comparisons, a little on how to stay motivated, and how to set goals when learning art. If you've been following along with these videos so far, you know that we've established the 5 skill pillars that we need to get good at painting and drawing, which are composition, value, colour, form, and technical skill. These 5 things, while encompassing more specialist fields, can be thought of as the biggest, most generic, most abstracted skills that every artist needs, regardless of whether they want to draw anime or architecture. We will begin learning and training these 5 skills, but before we do that, like any good experiment or development effort, we need to set a baseline so that we know where we are right now and where we want to get to. To start, I want to preload your minds with some concepts that are going to be useful. The first is reviewing, by which I mean being able to objectively look at your previous work to see where your strengths and weaknesses are. Next is baselining, which is setting a point in time and skill to measure from and compare to. And finally, goal setting, which is picking where you want to go in your chosen field of study. What you're seeing here are some of my old sketchbooks and notes. I started drawing when I was a teenager, having seen anime for the first time, and I took art at high school where I was told by not one but 2 teachers that I was so terrible at drawing and painting that I was actually forced to study sculpture instead. That is a true story. That led me to major in 3D design, where I did draw but only very basic sketches of things like furniture. So I have been drawing on and off for years, but it was always very unstructured learning. Just copying my favourite anime or comics, maybe trying to learn anatomy by copying images from an anatomy book, and it left me incredibly frustrated because I just never felt like I was improving. I still couldn't draw the things I wanted to, like anatomy, unless I had the book to look at, and when I could draw it, it still never came out as good as it did when I had a reference close by. I couldn't draw my own original comics or anime drawings like my favourite artists could. They had this ability to bring a story or world from their imagination to the page. It was like they somehow had this genetic ability to just draw anything from any angle and to make it look really cool and stylish, to tell stories, to paint cool, believable concepts, and my work seemed lame by comparison. That was when I decided to start over and not only learn about art as if it were a science, but to also learn how to learn, a subject called meta-learning. This was around 2020, and I treated it as a blank slate from which I could redirect myself towards the same goal I had always had, but in a more efficient and structured way. Working smarter, not harder. Looking back, I guess what I wanted at the time was the roadmap that other artists had used to hit the levels they were working at, some while still at an incredibly young age. And so this is what I did, and if you want to, you are welcome to follow along and try it yourself. It's a good little exercise, but by no means compulsory. I just found it good for figuring out where I was at the time and what my weaknesses were. The road was the 5 skill pillars: composition, value, colour, form and technical skill. And the good news was that despite my unstructured learning, I must have gotten at least some sort of foothold on these skills to get to this point. So that's what I'm doing here, analysing my old work through the lens of the 5 skill pillars. Now this is pretty easy for my previous work because I never used colour. In fact, I believed I couldn't paint, so I just never bothered, and the only time I ever worked with value was when I did things like hatching my drawings. These aren't finished sketches, so composition is non-existent. Therefore, the only things I was working on were the form pillar and the technical skill pillar. With regards to form, I had 2 bad habits that annoyed me. The first was drawing too small. I would draw a head the size of a postage stamp, and this is not really big enough to play with anything worthwhile, so I needed to draw bigger. Also, I had a habit of using really scratchy or woolly lines to try and rough in and draw my forms, which were always present in the finished sketch. It was distracting to the viewer and hard to discern what the proper form lines were. As you may have seen from my other videos, I've managed to mostly alleviate this issue by choosing to work in pen. When I feel like I do need to rough in some form, I do it with a very faint marker pen, which is invisible once dried and inked over. Anything you see that you think is good here is likely a reference from a photo, and the drawings where I tried working from imagination were always more obviously lacking. It seemed to me that quantity was not making a difference, and that maybe quality was the key to improvement. So let's consider this previous work a footprint, a record of where we have been up to this point in time. The next thing I did was I really thought about what I wanted to achieve with my art. At the time, I imagined maybe working as a professional concept artist, and maybe that's your goal, but perhaps you just want to be able to tell your own stories or paint watercolour portraits for people in your community. Try and think about what you want to do and where you want to be within the world of art, and this is not fixed. You can change it at any time. Try not to think in terms of, say, your Instagram follower count as a way of measuring your success or progress. This is just a number, and one likely at the mercy of a faceless computer algorithm, so it's never going to lead you to any sense of fulfillment as an artist. When we talk about goal setting for art, there are two broad types of goal: image related and position related. I gathered a bunch of images of art that I admired and tried to distill it down to 3 artists, one image from each that I thought best embodied this vision I had for myself, my future art self. I did this within the context of the skill pillars. This is an image related goal because I am using these images as a beacon to literally and physically represent where I want my future art self to be, producing work like this. We will refer to these images as our senpai images. There are 3 artists who I keep coming back to again and again, so there must be something inherent in their work that fascinates me. This provides a great opportunity to try and nail down what that is. The first artist I picked is Patrick O'Keefe, and this image in particular, which is from the first Spider-Verse movie. I probably could have picked any image from that film, but I chose this one, and analysing it through the lens of the skill pillar, I like how compositionally it helps to tell the story. You have the characters framed as silhouettes, and there's a decent sense of scale. The scene's quite low-key and dark in value, but that's being done deliberately to help frame the space and set up this emotional moment. The colours are not what you'd expect from a server room or technologically themed space because they're warm and a little bit unnerving, but they work because the underlying value structure works. Finally, and I don't know if this is some digital painting or technical skill trick, but the details like the wires and the lights, as simple as they are, just look cool. It makes everything feel so much more believable, and it gives the eye areas to rest and drink in the detail in contrast to the fairly simple focal point. The form and perspective really create a fantastic sense of depth. O'Keefe paints a lot of urban and city scenes, which is something I really enjoy doing, and so does the next artist I picked. The thing I love about Rob Ruppel's artwork is that the form is simplified into geometric shapes, yet the colours and textures are still quite realistic. The form pillar has been blunted down to remove anything too detailed or shapely, yet the colour and value pillars are refined and sharp. The fact that the forms have been trimmed down to really 2D graphic shapes means that he can control the composition more easily and how your eye works its way through the image, which is something I want to be able to do too. The values and colours seem to be referenced from a photograph or from life, but they're accurate and believable. The items in this image make it seem like a scene from everyday life, but it's been changed enough that it's taken on this cool, illustrated, stylized quality, and so it is, to me at least, more interesting than reality. He has decided what he wanted to emphasize about this boat and painted it. The final piece I have here is a character piece from the game Legends of Runeterra, which is part of the League of Legends universe, and this style of illustration and rendering seems to be very popular at the moment, maybe even a little bit cliched. This is the sort of art style that AI is clamoring to replicate. The form of the character is believable, yet still clearly stylized, somewhat cartoony, maybe like the sort of artwork that Pixar produces, but it's rendered to such a high degree that it's totally credible. It feels real. The lighting, the value, and the composition are controlled and help to tell the story, and the materials and textures all feel believable too. One thing I adore about the art for this card game is that each card has a colour scheme that relates to the region the cards belong to, so it's like a limitation that the artists are forced to conform to for every piece of art produced, and yet they come up with an awesome response to that challenge every single time. It makes these images part of a consistent family, and if I could produce something akin to this, well, that would be great. If you can pick a single senpai image to embody your desired art position, then even better, but I couldn't, and so I have a few. We shall consider these our destination. Now those were image-related goals, but a position-related goal is more about where you will be physically in the future. So for art, it might be to have your own art gallery showing, or to get employed as an artist at Riot, in which case you should try and regularly visualize yourself achieving that goal, imagine what it will feel like, and then work backwards from there to work out what criteria you need to meet to make that happen. Either way, it turns out that this action of defining our intentions is actually a wise thing to do when making a big investment of your time in order to learn a new skill. Research suggests that those with a clear plan in mind to act as a destination are up to 42 times more likely to achieve their goals, and they're so important because they provide a source of motivation. For me, I prefer to have a concrete example of a high quality piece of art, and my goal is to be able to do that for myself, and that's what motivates me. Image or position, or both, go with whatever motivates you personally. Some people feel hopeless when they compare their current work to their senpai image, but please don't. It's natural to feel disheartened when you can see a huge gap between where you are now and your goal, but we're literally taking steps to fix that right now. So try to flip those emotions on their head, try to fire yourself up. I actually do this by keeping a senpai image close to hand, like a wallpaper on my phone, to remind myself of what I'm aspiring to achieve. I often look at them before I start my daily training as well. On a personal note, drawing has been for me at times an escape. If I felt bad or I was struggling with things in life, I use drawing to take my mind off the situation. It's like a form of meditation for me, I suppose. If I ever let drawing become an unhappy place where I felt miserable and unmotivated, well, that would really suck. So I've tried really hard to stay motivated by looking at all the great art I find online as an achievable goal point that I can totally reach if I work smart and not as an impossible plateau. I really hope that bit of advice helps somebody one day. There are other types of goals that form an important part of a good strategy, like milestone goals and SMART goals, but we'll go over those in more detail another time. For now, you just need that destination. Now, progress in your art learning, like progress in any skill that requires what we call procedural learning, such as music or kickboxing or creative writing, is notoriously difficult to measure. This is because we cannot test ourselves for a measured increase in art skill like we can for, say, the bench press or Spanish vocabulary comprehension. The only way to measure this growth is to take intervaled snapshots of our art, and that's the last part of this exercise. Using all of our current knowledge of the skill pillars, even if that's absolutely zero, we're going to produce a piece of art. When you do this, it's important to pick which variables you want to fix in place so that a fair comparison can be made in the future. The easiest variables to fix are the subject, the tools, and the time. I'm actually going to do 2 studies today to demo for you lovely viewers to try and align with the goals of different types of artists who might be watching. First will be a character piece, that's the subject, with no background, rendered digitally in full colour using Photoshop and a Wacom tablet, that's the tools, and I'm not going to time myself on this piece, but I will make a note of how long I spend on it, that's my time. The second piece is going to be a traditional piece rendered in gouache in full colour from a photo reference, and this time I'm going to set myself a time limit of 1 hour. As you can see, there are no right or wrong ways to go about doing this, as long as you decide on the variables and keep them consistent when we repeat this exercise in the future. You might spend 5 hours rendering to a very polished level, or you might have to abandon the image part finished at the 1 hour mark. Make sure it's relevant to your future art self. If you never intend to work in colour, that's not a problem, just work in values or line. If you only ever intend to draw anime, make it an anime drawing, or maybe your own original character. If you want to work in oils and paint landscapes, then go do that. But whatever you do, remember you need to make it repeatable in the future using the same subject, the same tools, and the same amount of time. So take any photos you need to, or save any files you need for future reuse. And most importantly, keep this produced piece of art safe. We will be revisiting it. So let me show you mine, what variables I locked in, and how I'm considering the skill pillars. So this is the first piece I created. I wanted to make a character piece without a background, and I ended up settling on Ryu and Chun-Li from Street Fighter just off the top of my head because they're recognizable characters. I have a male and female figure. That gives me the chance to practice some different types of anatomy and some different materials, and I felt it would be relevant to all those watching who might be interested in producing more anime style drawings. You'll notice that the senpai images I chose were all digitally produced, and so I wanted to make a digital piece as well. The poses and anatomy here are entirely from my imagination because I wanted to push myself, but I did reference the costumes and the colours for each character. You can see I loosely put in some perspective, and I've tried to construct the figures in space to conform to this perspective layout. That's working the form pillar. I wasn't too concerned with composition for this one, but by the end, looking back, I felt that some of the angles and shapes created by the figures felt a bit unbalanced, so that's something I'm going to come back and seek to adjust in the future. I wanted to light the characters from above, and I tried to consider where the shadows would fall if this were the case, and how the lighting would help describe the form and make everything feel voluminous. Colour scheme is pretty much decided on because the characters are based on an existing franchise, but I didn't colour pick anything. That means I eyeballed every colour myself, and I tried to make the shadow areas cooler on Ryu and warmer on Chun-Li. As mentioned, I actually know very little about colour, so this really is just me trying my best as a beginner at digital painting, wishing somewhere in the back of my mind that this looked more like the art made by my senpai artists. Colour is definitely something I need to improve on for next time. The other thing this threw up for me was that I have no clue what sort of workflow professional artists use in programs like Photoshop to produce finished illustrations. I just blagged my way through this and probably missed all sorts of useful shortcuts or tricks that would have made a big difference, so that's something I definitely need to try and learn at some point, an improvement to the technical skill pillar. All in all, this took 45 minutes to draw and then around 2 hours to paint. Some minus distractions, it probably comes in at around 2.5 hours of work. I could have continued, but I just felt like I'd done all I could within my current skill level by this point, and so I decided to stop. I am aware that a piece polished to the standard of the Legends of Runeterra art that I showed earlier can take upwards of 8 hours to render, and that image was contributed to by 3 separate artists, so maybe I need to spend more time on this in future renditions. Get the idea now? I just tried my best thinking about the skill pillars. For the second piece, I got a photo I took from my phone. I tried to take photos of compositions I like at work or when I visit places, and I tried to remember what it looked like and felt like to be there at that moment. This is something you can't get from a photo taken by someone else, and so I encourage you to take your own photos wherever possible. You have a camera in your pocket anyway, so you might as well. I wanted to work in gouache in full colour, and I didn't want to put in a sketch. I just wanted to go for it and try to capture the shapes in the photo directly in paint. And remember, I'm limiting myself to 1 hour to complete this study. It measures 4 inches square, and in terms of composition, I'm just following the photo, but when I took this image last summer, I tried to get the vanishing point on the right third of the photo, and I tried to get the line where the trees meet the slope on the upper third line to try and create a nice composition using the rule of thirds. As previously mentioned, I know very little about colours. This is genuinely just me trying my best to get something decent with my very limited knowledge. I only used 3 colours, which were the primaries, red, blue and yellow, as well as white and black, using Winsor & Newton designer gouache, and this is a watercolour sketchbook with 200 GSM paper. I started by underpainting the whole scene in a yellow wash, probably a little bit too intensely in hindsight, but it's something I've tried before and it felt like it made a difference, showing through underneath everything else and making the end result seem brighter. It also helps to somewhat unify the colours if handled correctly, which I'm not sure I managed here, but the intention was definitely there. I found it quite difficult to match a few of the colours, like for the sky, without a more cyan blue, and was also very limited in the amount of greens I could create with such a limited palette. So as I learn more about the colour pillar, I definitely want to expand my palette a bit more. One thing I did find easier than usual was the idea of seeing the colours as values. I felt that I managed to get some form depicted in the distant tree line. I tried the same thing with the clouds, but found that a lot harder. When you do a painting like this, you find that the colour, value and form pillars really are all just the same thing. You can isolate them when training, but when executing a finished painting, they really just form one big pillar. Finally, the technical skill pillar really needs work. I'm still not that experienced with gouache, and sometimes I make mistakes like working an area too much and reactivating what's underneath. I also struggled to get the grassy texture to show through with brushes, but I remembered a trick that Alyosha Blau uses where he adds paint to a pen nib and draws with the paint, which makes thin details like grass very easy to depict. After around 45 minutes, I felt I really couldn't do much more, so I stopped. I came away feeling that I need to learn a lot more about gouache as a material, and that once again my lack of understanding of colour is really letting me down. So I have some intel now on where my weaknesses are at this moment, and this is our art snapshot. We'll be recreating it at set intervals in the future to see how we've improved, using the same references or subjects with the same materials and potentially the same time frame. How often you do this is entirely down to you. Some people might prefer to leave it a year. I'll be recreating my studies every 200 hours to try and track my progress for the purposes of this channel, which will be sometime in 2024 given my current training regime. With this, we have our roadmap partially completed. We can see where we have been, where we are going, and where we are right now. So to recap, we have discussed how having a roadmap is useful for getting good at art or any other skill you care to master, how our previous experience has led us to this point, where we are right now, where we are going, and how to measure progress for slippery, hard to measure skills like art by reperforming a baseline action at set intervals. Thanks for watching, I hope that helped. I'd love to know what your art goals are if you feel like sharing them in the comments, but as I mentioned, this is not an absolute necessity for being good at art or anything else. I just found that it helped me, and the neuroscience studies I've read regarding goal setting do support it. If you'd like to read more about goal setting and how it can help you, a good introduction to the subject is Learn Like a Pro by Barbara Oakley and Olaf Schur. We have our art learning map started. Now we need the directions to get from here to there, which will be the subject of my next video, so I hope you can join me next time where we'll be going over the meta-learning concepts that I believe hold the key to turbocharging your art learning and how to implement them.